Welcome to Module 7, Administrative Evaluations and Providing Strategic Feedback, part of 641 School District Operations and Leadership.
Hello again, this is Chris Sadler, Director of Human Resources for the Sun Prairie Area School District. Again, I've introduced other slideshows, so I won't go over my past here. You kind of know it, and I left some of the notes up there. But this slideshow is really important because educational philosophy is really about what you believe as a leader and how it plays out in your everyday work. And this quote by John F. Kennedy always kind of sits in the top of my head is that children are the world's most valuable resource and its best hope for the future. And that's really the baseline for my why, is that the kids we work with are truly going to carry our country, our communities forward. And that's why I place so much importance on being an educational leader. And that's why a lot of educational leaders do what we do.
This module will review some of the things that were talked about in 640 around administrative evaluations, but then also kind of leading into more of a focus on strategic feedback and what that means for evaluations. We'll be looking through some examples of evaluations and then also talking about strategies on how best to provide feedback for leadership, especially if you're a superintendent or a director of some sort that you are leading other administrators. But as a principal too, you may have an assistant principal, a director of special education may have other managers that they are providing feedback for within the leadership role, but also looking for feedback on your own as a leader to make sure that you are meeting the needs of all the stakeholders you are serving and leading. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of administrator evaluations. A lot of the times, in the past especially, we've been looking at evaluations that are more focused on inputs rather than outputs. And what I mean by that is basically that a lot of evaluations in the past and currently too have been focusing on inputs, like what have you done to improve yourself and how have you brought that into yourself. And that focus was on professional development, culture building strategies, that may or may not have outputs attached to them, communication strategies, systemic changes, evaluation structures. You may do all of that and show how much you've put in. But really, when we think about evaluation, there should be a balance with outputs, which when you think about outputs, it could be anything from student achievement data. And when I say student achievement data, that means everything, both from standardized assessments to formative assessments that you're doing within your department, building, district, student survey results, attendance results from students, behavior, outcomes, whatever it might be. You can bring all of those in, and we really should be attaching some of that to evaluations. Not everything, because if that was everything, that would also be, a very one-sided evaluation. So you want to balance the inputs with outputs. Other outputs that you may have are staff retention data. How are you leading your department, your school? Are people satisfied? Are they engaged? Are they staying with you? Other engagement survey results may come from parents, from students, from staff, from other stakeholders that you are specifically serving. So again, when we look at evaluations, many of you may look at the evaluations that of your certification in the district you're working in and find out that almost all the evaluations are based on inputs and very little on outputs. When again, there should be a balance if we truly want a balanced evaluation, and from an administrative standpoint to find out, am I being effective? Is the professional development, the strategies I'm putting in place, are they having the intended outcomes that I want? Because I want that to show up in my evaluation too, because that feedback provides for me to be a better leader and a better serving of those people we work or lead. So what I want you to do is I'm going to have some evaluations popping up here in a second, and they are in resources as well. I want you to look through these and find your specific certification. You can be curious about others too if you want to open those up. Are these examples more input-based or output-based? Now, I pulled things from various districts and states. It wasn't just Wisconsin, because I thought some of them were really interesting and things to think about as you move into different administrator roles that you might want to bring into either your own evaluation or work through the evaluations of your leaders. So I thought these were kind of interesting. Obviously, the Wisconsin principal evaluation, the superintendent evaluation, which actually is one that's from Michigan, and some other examples here too of a business manager, director of instruction, director of special education. And then I also put in some Sun Prairie examples of admin evaluations. And again, none of these are the end all be all. I think some of them just show different angles to looking at input based or output based type of evaluations. And some of them are very, very output based. And I want you to be able to recognize that and look through them and just kind of get an idea of what evaluations will look like and take that different lens to them now. Is if you were to step into this role, how would you want the evaluation to actually exemplify your work? So this link to an article called A Framework for Principal Evaluation. I know it's focused on principals, but I want you to look at it from every certification lens and just put that word in. So instead of principal evaluation, to director of instruction or superintendent evaluation. And I want you to think about a couple questions. How does this framework inform you in evaluating based on outcomes? How would you as a supervisor balance feedback between outputs and inputs? Because again, an evaluation needs to be balanced and your feedback does too. As a leader being evaluated, how would you show the connection between the inputs and outputs of your work? Not just within this article, but just think about that as you're going through an evaluation process and you're being evaluated or you're evaluating others. How are you showing the connection or others showing the connection between what you're doing and what's actually happening? And be able to draw, sometimes not always a direct line, but a line that's strong enough to understand that those inputs are having the intended effects. And if they're not, what would you do next? One thing that I think is really important, both from being evaluated and being the evaluator, is the really important process of continuous improvement. When you think about feedback, it needs to be regular, it needs to be ongoing, and it's not just part of the evaluation process once or twice a year. I know that plates are full, and it's not that simple. To provide feedback on an ongoing basis. But if you really look at your schedule, one is you want to schedule it in. And then two is always have that frame of mind that I can provide feedback at any moment. I can walk into a classroom. I can think about a meeting that just was led by one of the people I evaluate or I'm being evaluated on. And you can provide that feedback or look for feedback in those times. Leaders need feedback. As leaders, we think about how we serve others, especially when we think about the people on the quote unquote front lines, like teachers, assistants. But there are many times we forget about our leaders, especially the more responsibility you have, it seems like the less targeted feedback you get. So you need to find ways to really think about your leaders because they are the ones that need to know how things are looking within their position. Are they being strategic? Is their work connecting to the strategic plan of the district? And if you don't provide that feedback as their evaluator, they have to really kind of guess on what's going well and what isn't. They can look at outputs and understand that, but they need to hear it from you as well as their evaluator. But then on the other side too, as a leader, you need to search out feedback. And we'll talk a little bit about feedback loops here in a second. The feedback that you do provide needs to be connected to strategic goals and plans. A lot of the times, I'm sure many of you have had this, is people will give very general feedback of like, wow, you really ran a good meeting, or you're doing a great job. Those are nice to hear. But over the long run, if that's all you hear, it can be, it actually can be a little demoralizing because you're doing a lot of work and you're not getting feedback based on that work. But also, you want to make sure that the feedback you do give is helpful and purposeful. Otherwise, people that you are evaluating and providing feedback to tend to start tuning you out because it's not going to be important to them. And then also feedback connected to personal goals, because a lot of times we get very focused on strategic planning and the goals that you set within that as a leader. But also make sure that you're talking with people about their own personal goals or personal development of their leadership skills or the next thing they're working on for their own development, because it shows an interest in them. And also it's an input. Like most of those personal goals are input goals that they want to get better at or learn more about. And again, it's a balance between input and output. And then finally, this is where the feedback loop comes into play. We really need to make sure that feedback for leaders should come from multiple perspectives, which means that typically that's the people you serve, your teachers, your assistants, the administrators that you lead, the parents, the students. You want to make sure you get perspectives from all levels, that they're also telling you how are things going from their perspective, because it will shed a light on those outputs that you're meeting. Sometimes from the outside, the outputs might look great, but then somebody might provide that real deep perspective on, yeah, the outputs are great, but this is how I feel. And that's a really important piece to think about. So in the links on this page, we have started 7 strategies for effective feedback. Some of them are the same ones we just talked about. Others are just good to think about. It's not really from a school perspective, it's just from a leadership perspective. And then the other video that's on here is 360-degree feedback, like question ideas for leadership. This article is really just a simple explanation of feedback looping. What are some of the questions you can ask? The one thing I would say is that the survey that is in this one is lengthy. So one thing that I always think about when I want 360 feedback, like people providing me feedback just as much as I provide them, I want to make it simple yet effective, because I want them to actually take time to do it. If it's too long, they won't take time to do it, and if they do, it'll be a very surface level. So 3 to 5 questions is probably all you really want to focus on per year, and possibly send it out a couple times, as you're trying to change things up and improve. These are just 2 videos I would like you to watch. The first one is The Secret to Giving Great Feedback, about 5 minutes, very simple. It's actually very science-based on how feedback can be effective, and the simple things you can do to remember as you provide feedback or look for feedback to improve. And then the other one is really 5 minutes. It's Simon Sinek. Very simple explanation of how leadership is built over time. In the beginning, as he usually does, it's kind of on a tangent. Talks a little bit about how relationships turn into love. I get that, but then just watch the rest of it, because he will link it into leadership and how that ongoing practices provide that connection with people. And I look at it when I listen to it, especially towards the end, as I realize how feedback is exactly what he's alluding to. Is that the more feedback, the more regular feedback that happens, the stronger your people get, and actually the stronger connection with you they get as well, because they feel like you're listening and providing them feedback because you care. So it's a really interesting video that you can kind of see how that can play out as a leader, and how it can make your leadership much stronger as you build strength over time. Thank you for listening. Please contact me if you have any questions via private discussion or email. And the private discussion obviously is on the Educate website. And thank you.